I think we're good to go now. This is session 10 in our study of the book of Hebrews. And our plan tonight is going to be a little different. We're going to be in chapter 8, but we're going to look at other chapters. There's really a lot of interaction among the themes, basically in chapters 8 through about the middle of chapter 10. And so I'm going to try a little bit different, rather than just focusing in one place and then looking elsewhere. We're going to do more maybe jumping around. And that means in subsequent weeks, counting tonight, we have four sessions to go before Joni and I are gone for 2 Thursdays. And so in my mind, it makes sense if we can reasonably get through what we need to get through and finish on that last session. Then after we get back from this, Joni and I are going to Turkey, and so get back from that. We'll take up a new study. So bring something to a close and start something else. So you might be thinking about what you'd like to study next. So that's the plan for tonight, to do a little more jumping around, and that means we won't perhaps cover so many of the details in any given chapter, but I think we'll get what we need to get for now. Obviously, I'm always open to your questions. So let's start with chapter 7. We touched on this when we met before Easter, but let's start with verse 26 and just go to the end of chapter 7. For it was fitting that we should have such a high priest. Remember, chapter 7 was all about a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, blameless, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he has no need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins, and then for those of the people. This he did once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests those who are subject to weakness, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever, again, according to the order of Melchizedek. So there are a couple of contrasts in this paragraph that I thought we should look at as a kind of launching point into the study this evening. So unlike the other high priests, let's go back and look at the law in Leviticus. So Leviticus chapter 9, verse 7. Then Moses said to Aaron, his brother, who becomes the high priest, draw near to the altar and sacrifice your sin offering and your burnt offering, and make atonement for yourself and for the people, and sacrifice the offering of the people, etc. Okay, so there it clearly indicates the high priest has to offer a sacrifice for his own sins. Now, Leviticus 16, verse 6. This is in the chapter that gives the instructions for sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. So the Day of Atonement is a big day. 16:6. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. So first, he offers sacrifice for himself and his own sin, and then he offers sacrifice for the people. And writer of Hebrews is saying, our high priest doesn't have to do that. He doesn't have to offer sacrifice for himself. That really makes him a better high priest. Okay, here's another set of contrasts. So look back in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 28. And in the way my version reads, and we can check other versions here, but there are 2 points here. The law appoints, but also the oath appoints. The way it reads in mine is it says, the law appoints as high priest those who are subject to weakness. But the word of the oath, which came later than law, appoints. So the word of the oath appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. You can tell them to. Sorry, we've got a lot of noise in the room. Can you hear that?
A little bit.
It's kitchen noise. So, okay, so the law appoints, the oath appoints. And let's just take a minute and look at that one verse. What are the differences you see here between the law appointing and the oath appointing? Any ideas?
I'll be dumb. What's the
Good.
oath?
What is the oath? That's a great question. Where do we find the oath? This is a good principle of Bible study too. Where is the oath? It's been a minute since we looked at this, so it's a good question.
And I swore in my wrath. Like the oath is like in chapter 4 or 5.
Well, don't go back quite that far. Maybe somewhere in chapter 7. Chapter 7 references which psalm?
110.
Uh-huh. Would do I have a volunteer to look at Psalm 110, verse 4?
Oh, sorry, verse 20 and 7.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. What does verse 20 say?
And it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made with such without an oath, but this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever.
Okay, let's think about that for a second. So why is the oath better than the commandment of the law?
Repeat that again?
Swearing? Go ahead.
Repeat that again. What did you ask?
Why is the oath sworn better than the commandment of the law? This is one of the contrasts. The law appoints, the oath appoints, but one is better than the other. Why?
It's God's oath.
Yeah.
Exactly. The question is, who's doing the swearing? And by swearing here, we really mean promising or asserting that I will do this, right? So if the Lord swears that this person is a priest forever, right? All those words matter. You are a priest forever. And the writer of Hebrews says, look, these words apply to Jesus. So his high priesthood is categorically different than the high priesthood of the descendants from Aaron. So that the oath is, it's actually God's swearing in Psalm 110 that then the writer of Hebrews is picking up on in Hebrews chapter 7.
Well, even the text said about the law appointing is the one who, or they are not blameless or whatever. They're sinful, that sort of thing. So
right, yeah, they're subject to weakness. They have
weakness,
problems.
yes.
Yeah, we have problems. You know, I mean, as a pastor, I don't think of myself as a priest, but I mean, we got all the problems that everybody else has, right? But not this high priest, right? He's tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. So there's really a clear dividing line between the kind of priest that Jesus is and the kind of priest that the normal everyday priests are. Okay, so we've been talking about that. I forgot I put that little animation in there. Oh, Joanne, you figured it out.
Who knows?
Yeah.
It's magic.
Okay. Okay, so that in a way that's a little refresher, Joni.
Is that also Elsie?
I'm on here.
Yeah, Elsie, that's Elsie.
Hi, Elsie.
Hi.
A little refresher, you know, we spent a lot of time in chapter 7 2 weeks ago, so that's kind of the capping off of chapter 7. but it's also the kind of the taking off into material in chapter 8 and following. So there's a lot on the screen, I know, but we're gonna try to do it this way. So we're really looking at 4 major topics tonight. The 4 basic topics are the priesthood, which we've covered that, right? In chapter 7, we really covered the priesthood. And the contrast is it's temporary. But Jesus' priesthood is forever, based on Psalm 110, verse 4, according to Hebrews now, right? According to the writer of Hebrews. So we won't go over the priesthood again, but that's one of the major themes in the book of Hebrews. Now we're going to look at sacrifice. And here we get sacrifice, we get references to sacrifice, we get references to the temple, we get references to covenant, and there's a little bit of back and forth. He really weaves together these themes. Now, we just have to think about this for a second. Priesthood, sacrifice, temple, covenant. These are big deals to Jews. I mean, this is their whole identity we're talking about in some ways. Priesthood, sacrifice, temple, and covenant. And now the writer of Hebrews is really saying, we have to think differently now about all these categories because of Christ. So let's start with sacrifice. And we'll look first at chapter 9, 23 through 28. These aren't, I've laid them out this way, but we could have done this in kind of a different order. There's nothing special about the order we're doing this, but okay, 9:23 through 28. Thus it was necessary for the sketches of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, sacrifice, but the heavenly things themselves need better sacrifices than these. Now we'll come back to the heavenly thing when we get to the temple. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one, but he entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Now we get down to the brass tacks. Nor was it to offer himself again and again, as the high priest enters the holy place year after year with blood that is not his own. For then he would have had to suffer again and again since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the age to remove sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for mortals to die once, and after that the judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. Now let me just say a quick word about time here, and then set it aside unless you want to talk about it, but we're going to focus on the sacrifice. But notice the sort of understanding of time at reference to before the foundation of the world. Okay, this takes us back to chapter 1, verse 3. He's the image of the invisible God, the exact imprint of his very being. So eternal. You are a priest forever, right? This is an eternal thing. And then his death, he bears the sins of many in his death. And then at the end of time, or the end of the age, he will appear again, not to suffer again, but really to establish the fullness of his kingdom. All right, so this eternal kind of sacrifice, and it's effective for all who will receive it. It only has to happen once. Now let's look at chapter 10, verse 9. What does it say there? Somebody read 10, verse 9.
Then he said, Behold, I have come to do thy will. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. By this will
Okay,
we have been.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, just verse 10, yeah, or verse 9, excuse me.
Okay, that was it.
Yeah, that's good, yeah. Now, and we're gonna come back, there's more to this point, but what I want us to focus on right now is the contract again, a contrast. The first, and now the second or the subsequent. Let's see, how does it say it? He abolishes the first in order to establish the second. Okay, so let's think about what is being abolished.
Sacrificial system.
The sacrificial system is being abolished, right? Now this gets really tricky, you know, because before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, Jews are still sacrificing. Now we don't know exactly when Hebrews is written. You know, I'm inclined to follow those scholars who say it's probably written before 70 AD. Otherwise, it would have. That's such a cataclysmic event that it probably would have shaped the way this book is written, and it doesn't appear to do that. So I mean, whether we agree with this or not, we can just think, what would it be like to be Jews and to be very accustomed to the sacrificial system? And now this Jewish Christian is saying Christ's death abolishes the sacrificial system. We don't need anymore because his blood atonement is sufficient for all sin. This is very, very radical. And I think it's maybe, but we're so used to this kind of language, it might be kind of hard for us to grasp just how, wow, you know, these are, this would be really making people think.
So, Steve.
Yeah.
Go ahead, I'll see.
No, that's okay.
Oh, okay. Sure.
I mean, and it really was abolished. When the temple
When
was
the temple was
destroyed.
destroyed, yeah, it was.
I mean, like, oh,
Yeah,
but you don't hear anybody saying, well, God acted,
right,
but
yeah,
certainly makes you scratch your head.
right. Well, this sort of argument that the writer is making would get us into what we could call Jewish Christian relations and some of the difficulties over the centuries of that, you know, where there are times in history where Christians are blaming Jews, you know, you are Christ killers and therefore we have the right to kill you. It gets into all kinds of ugly things. And the tendency then is for us to sort of shy away from some of these controversies. But here, I mean, you know, this is where we keep in mind, this writer is a Jewish background believer in Jesus as Messiah. So he's not renouncing his Jewishness. He's just saying that Jesus is the long-awaited promised Messiah. He's the one we've been looking for, we Jews, right? Don't turn back. Don't turn back to the sacrificial system, these other rites. You know, if you do that, you're really renouncing Christ when you do that, renouncing the Messiah. Okay. So this question then, what is the weakness of Levitical sacrifices? Why is he, you know, if I'm one of these believers that's kind of struggling a little bit, I want him to tell me, why is that a problem? If I go back to this sacrificial system, I grew up with it. This is what we do. What we Jews do. Why is this wrong, right? Why is the old way, the first way, weak? Well, we can see the answer to that question in chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. What does it say there? What's the point? You know, if you want to read the verses, feel free, but what's the reason? What is the weakness?
They're ceremonial.
They cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper.
Yeah. These sacrifices deal with externals. They
Right.
deal with outward behavior. They deal with, you know, ceremonial activities. they don't deal with the heart. You can do all the sacrifices, but they will not perfect or bring to completion. They will not purify the heart, so they will not perfect the conscience. So, I mean, taking some time to imagine what that phrase perfect the conscience means. What does it suggest? Perfect here does not mean flawless. Remember, this is a Greek New Testament way of understanding perfection. It does mean to bring to completion. It means God accomplishes something in us that the sacrificial system doesn't accomplish. Look at chapter 7, verse 11. Again, that notion of perfection in my version. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, what further need would there have been to speak of another priest? There's a kind of either or logic here. If
Right.
if the Levitical sacrificial system works, if it accomplishes what God says it needed to accomplish, then you don't need Jesus. But it doesn't. And this is where if we were Jews and had a good knowledge of Jewish history, Paul does this, the writer of Hebrews is doing this. He's saying to these people, look, we had the laws, we had the sacrifice, we had the commandments. We didn't keep them. It didn't work, right? Our lives didn't change. We were guilty of idolatry and all kinds of other things. So that's what he's driving at here. It's Christ who actually brings the change about. It's his sacrifice. Joni?
Well, I don't know, I'm just thinking, it just logically recognize that the blood of an animal is, as Larry said, just a ceremonial thing. It's not it doesn't, you know what I mean? It doesn't really do anything to me.
Well, I mean,
Except that it takes away your sin for a second until you sin again.
Yeah, yeah. But even, does it
Yeah.
even, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, in chapter 10, it says that sacrifices and offering God has not desired.
yeah,
Like God really doesn't want the blood of
right.
an animal.
Yeah, even though he commanded it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. He takes no pleasure in burnt offerings and sin offerings.
Right. Yeah, I think this is a very important point and it's a little slippery. So let me see if I can say what I'm thinking. We should not say that the ceremony is merely a ceremony. Because, somebody could come back and say, well, look, you treat communion the same way, right?
Yeah.
You take communion, it's a means of grace, it's a sacrament, you're getting God's grace, and then 15 minutes later, you send it away, If it's just a ceremony, then you got the same problem that you're saying the Jews have. So there we have to be kind of careful, and that's why this idea of perfecting the conscience, when Christ dies on the cross, his sacrifice does something, not just for us, but in us, that changes our way of being. So I think we have to be careful not to just be too blasé about ceremonies and things like that.
So do you think then that sacrifice was in their day a means of grace? Like what? Because, okay, and let me also say that we don't think communion is saving us. We don't think communion is atoning. The communion, the bread and the
act and the symbols themselves Right, but they are a means of grace. We receive God's grace through the act of taking them, through these symbols. We
Well,
receive
that's why
God's
I'm
grace.
asking if the Old Testament sacrifice was in that sense a means of grace.
Well, I think in some sense, I think the answer is yes, it is. Or it's intended to be. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a parallel here that I can take communion mindlessly, thoughtlessly, don't really care about it. I'm just going through the motions. You know, I'm exaggerating here a little bit, but and I think it's kind of the same problem. You know, I mean, this is the problem of any church that overemphasizes the efficacy of its rituals.
Yes.
Right? The rituals themselves just do the work. And I mean, there's no doctrine, you know, for Protestants, the easy target here is our view of Catholic teachings on the Mass and things like that. And I just think we have to be really careful because I'm not sure we know Catholic teaching well enough to kind of put the boundaries that they have around these things. But it is true, you know, that if I'm a kind of a nominal Catholic and I'm not really thinking about anything, I can get this idea, you know, I just go to Mass and I get what I need and that's it. And I don't really have to think much about it or worry about my relationship with God because you know, that's really the body of Jesus. And now I've literally eaten the body of Jesus and that does it, right? I mean, that's not Catholic teaching, but it is possible for Catholics to think that way, just the way it's possible for Methodists to be kind of blasé about our understanding of communion.
And I need to get a little bit further down.
All right, what does Jesus' sacrifice accomplish then, right? If the Levitical sacrifice doesn't do what we need it to do, what does Jesus' sacrifice accomplish? Look at chapter 9, verse 14, back to that section.
Wow, that's pretty big area. Well, you said to bear with me here, give me a good time to get through some of these parameters.
Cleanse your conscience.
Sorry?
It says cleanse your conscience.
That's right.
From dead
version
works.
says purify. Purify your conscience.
Mhm.
See?
That's a big area to change it right there.
So there's something effective about the atoning work of Christ that the Levitical sacrificial system does not accomplish. So sacrifice, right? This is a better sacrifice in Jesus Christ. He's not sacrificing an animal, he is sacrificing himself. He becomes the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world.
Right. This one, I don't know. It's the Open Bible and it says, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God.
Right, yeah. So at the very minimum, it moves us away from the idea that if I just do the right things, I'm okay with God.
Yeah.
Right.
It's more about a heart connection to God, a belief in God himself, a reliance on God, a faith in God, in Christ. So there's this personal investment, you might say, because of what Christ has done, that is sufficient in a way that the Levitical sacrificial system turned out not to be. Okay,
Yeah, that's the way I see it.
good. All right, let's go on to the temple then. Temple. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5. Somebody read 8:5 for us.
They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain.
Okay, this is a fascinating verse, I think. Okay, my version uses the word sketch. So Larry said copy.
Yeah.
a sketch and shadow, or a copy and a shadow of the real temple. Where's the real temple?
Heaven,
In heaven.
Heaven,
heaven.
right? Okay, it gets a little weird here, right? For us, it's getting a little weird, but let's work with it. All right, let's go then. So it says, he's really referring to Exodus chapter 25:40. So let's go to Exodus 25:40. Exodus 25:40.
Northeast of freedom right now, you're in freedom right now. So thank you.
These are instructions from the Lord to Moses up on the mountain. And in those instructions for the temple, God says, and see that you make them according to the pattern for them, which is being shown you on the mountain. So the pattern, right? And this is referred to back in Hebrews chapter 8. You get the sense that I think the most kind of straightforward way I can say it is that the heavenly temple is really you might say in the mind of God, in God's presence. So when we read that word temple, we want to think of a kind of physical structure, and it's hard for us to imagine, like a building way up in the sky somehow. This is why it's a little hard for us to imagine. But if we start to realize, kind of flex with these words and concepts a little bit, the pattern for the temple comes from the mind of God, comes from the presence of God. Okay, so our English word pattern here is the Greek word. We translate the Greek word into the English word type. A type. Tipon, and that's that picture from Exodus 25. The Hebrew word is tabnith. So what is a type, right? Well, these are where the words, we kind of circle around this idea without necessarily landing squarely on it. Pattern, type, sketch, copy. We're sort of gesturing at something that we can't quite nail down the reality, but we know that the earthly temple or tabernacle, because in Exodus, we're really talking about the portable tabernacle, the tent, the movable one. We know that that's not the reality that we're going for, right? There's something more real, even though we've got to use these limited words and we use a physical structure to help us grasp at the real thing. That's what's being said here. But again, in the background, what we have working are these ideas like the eternal nature of God, right? The eternal nature of God is what provides stability. God is not pushed around by the variations of this world and this life. So the tabernacle or the temple of Jerusalem is really important. It's beautiful, it's glorious. It's not the reality that we're talking about. Now, to anticipate where this goes, when we get to chapter 11 of Hebrews and we read about Abraham, who's looking for a city whose architect and builder is God, right? He's in the land that God promised him, but he doesn't settle down any particular place because he knows there's something more real. That's what the writer is trying to convey here and get across. So let's look at chapter 9, verse 1 through 5. And then verse 12. Now again, this is mixing in covenant. We're going to touch on covenant. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly sanctuary. For a tent was constructed, the first one, in which were the lampstands, the table, and the bread of the presence. This is called the holy place. So that's the, we're inside the tabernacle proper, but it's not the most holy place. It's where those items are found. Behind the second curtain was a tent called the Holy of Holies. In it stood the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which there was a golden urn holding the manna and Aaron's rod that budded and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot speak now in detail, right? So again, he's just laying out the basic structures and items in the tabernacle, which then in the Jerusalem temple, he's talking about the tabernacle in the wilderness, but the Jerusalem temple is patterned the same way. It has that holy place with the table of the bread of presence and all that. It has the Holy of Holies with the Ark of the Covenant, the cherubim, all that.
So why can he not talk about them in detail? Are they no longer in existence?
By that time, they're not.
I don't think we can get that from this verse.
Okay.
Short answer is I don't know, but I don't think we can draw that conclusion that it's because the temple has been destroyed. Because he's talking about the tabernacle here. He's making a reference to Moses and the beginning of the sacrificial system and all that.
So that's why he can't speak in detail, because they don't have a tabernacle anymore. They have now a temple.
I think there could be half a dozen reasons why he can't speak in detail. We just don't know,
Okay.
Now look at verse 12. He entered once for all into the holy place, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. Okay, what did he enter? He didn't go into the temple to offer sacrifice.
The heavenly temple.
Yeah, again, and I mean, Jesus' crucifixion is very, very much of this earth, right? It's a very real flesh and blood thing. But here, there's something mysterious being revealed here, that Christ's death on the cross carries the reality of entering into this holy place where the sacrifice is offered. And again, the result is eternal redemption. It doesn't have to be repeated. Okay, now this is where, and I'm doing a little just step to the side for a moment, little side trip here. Doesn't have anything to do with the substance of what we're talking about, but you can see there this reference to scholarly disagreements. This is where Bible scholars get into speculation about. I've read some scholars say this kind of talk about the earthly and the heavenly and the shadow and the copy suggests that the writer is very influenced by the philosopher Plato and his view of reality. And it's kind of a dualistic view. There's this spiritual realm that's transcendent, and there's this earthly realm, and the real reality is that spiritual realm, and that's why the writer is talking about these things in this way. Now that, plenty of other scholars don't agree with that. Like the ones I'm following will say, well, yeah, I mean, Plato was one of the philosophers of the day, and so this guy's obviously intelligent. He's probably aware of Plato, so it's not, it's not completely separated off from Plato. But the idea that I can explain these references to the copy and the reality by virtue of Plato is really a kind of explaining away of the power of this vision that he has about what Christ is actually accomplishing. So I just said that, when you do Bible studies and sometimes you read commentators, you're going to get if you really get into these things, you get a range of opinions, and you get scholars who are really, really smart. Sometimes sometimes they just have bad ideas. You know, they're just bad ideas. They may be logical in some way, they may be plausible in some way, but they turn out to be not necessary and maybe another agenda or, you know, things like that. So I don't want to make too much of that, but this is one of those places where, you know, in a study Bible or something like that, you may read a footnote that talks about Plato and the forms and this sort of thing, and you get that idea. Yeah, Joni.
Well, I was just wondering what's wrong? What's wrong with saying that the ideas of Plato, you know, you don't have to accept everything about what Plato says. But that the ideas of Plato then are put to use to make this argument.
Right, yeah, you could say it that way, totally legitimate. Typically, it's a criticism that the writer is kind of going not really historical now. You know, he's doing this kind of theological speculation thing that's not really historical. And then so a little bit less than appropriate or a little bit less than. And I just sometimes, you know, you run across comments like that, and I just if that just worries you, then just forget what I said, because it doesn't matter that much. But they're almost on everything about the Bible. Scholars have a range of viewpoints. Now, there's a lot of shared understanding as well, but you can get into narrow points of you know, questions, and it can get sometimes pretty, the disagreements get pretty heated. Priesthood, sacrifice, temple, and covenant. Okay, again, we get this first covenant and then the better covenant. So Hebrews 9, 1-5, we read, but we were, for the moment, we were focusing on the sacrificial part of it. Now go back and look at what it says at the very beginning. The first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly sanctuary. So there's the commandments related to the sacrificial system and the sanctuary. The better covenant. Now, really, that's almost the rest of chapter 8. Because starting with verse 8 in chapter 8, you get a quotation of what?
Not Jeremiah.
31.
Jeremiah
Yeah.
31 through 34. And if you just, we don't have to read it all, but scan down through there. Here we have the promise of the new covenant. So again, the writer of Hebrews is quoting from the prophet, the very Jewish prophet, Jeremiah. A new covenant is coming. It's not like the covenant that was in place, a covenant that you broke, Jeremiah says. New covenant. I will put my law in their hearts. I will write it on their hearts, right? They'll all know me. As you look at that, let's think about the differences now between a sacrificial system that focuses on behaviors, getting everything behaviorally right. The animal has to be right. The motions the priest make has to be right. All that, compared to what you're reading here. And we see the difference. Not a law of externals, but a law written on the heart. They will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. So the focus, the orientation, the experience is different here. It's different. It's the difference between outward behavior, which is good. We're not rejecting the outward behaviors and the rituals and the ceremonies. We have them, we need them. We're not rejecting them, but that's not the outward behaviors alone are not enough to get at what Jesus is getting at, which is to perfect, to purify the conscience. Okay, chapter 10, verse 16. And just in case we didn't get it, he repeats from Jeremiah 31. Okay. These four themes are really big deals for the Jews. And this Jewish believer in Jesus, this Christian, is saying that Christ reconfigures and reorients everything about Jewish life.
But I feel the love.
Are we hearing the background noise again? Am I?
Yes.
Something going on. Somebody's talking.
Yeah. Sorry, whoever that is. Okay, carrying on then, and here I'm going to borrow from David De Silva's work, his commentary. He wrote a short commentary on Hebrews. Now let's look at the importance of a mediator. So along with these other things, we're going to look at the idea of mediator, because the writer takes us there. He says, De Silva says, somebody in your circle, he's defining mediator. So think about a mediator. Somebody in your circle who is connected to the person that you need to get to, right? That you need help from. So I say here, the necessary person. Somebody in your circle who's connected to, that's the role of the mediator. The mediator can go on your behalf to the source to get what's needed. So let's use Luke 7 as a kind of a good example of the function of a mediator. So Luke 7, 1 through 10. It's the story about the centurion's servant being healed. So look at verse 2. A centurion there had a slave whom he valued highly. This is the centurion in Capernaum, and he had been a benefactor to the Jewish people in Capernaum. Had a slave whom he valued highly and who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him. There's the mediator, right? The centurion doesn't have direct access to Jesus, or doesn't think he does. So he sends these Jewish elders to go talk to Jesus about healing his servant. They serve the function of mediator that the writer of Hebrews, there's not necessarily a connection between these passages, but it's Luke 7 is a good example of the function of mediator. And now the writer of Hebrews is saying, this is what Jesus is doing, right? In being better than all these things that have been so familiar to us and so important to us, what he's doing is he's putting us in touch with God, right? That's what a mediator does. Moses did it. He was a mediator. It's the role of the high priest. Jesus does it par excellence.
It's also the role of the Catholic priest, is it not?
It is. And the truth is, I think every pastor in some way, I want to be really careful here, but I've been very aware over the years pastoring, the truth is that the pastor's prayer is no more effective than anyone else's prayer.
Right.
But there is a kind of symbolic importance. When the pastor comes to pray, there's, I don't know how to describe this. I don't think it's this way for everybody, but I think for a lot of Christians, when the pastor comes to pray with you, that somehow that gives it a little bit of extra something or other. Now, as a pastor, I don't think it has that extra something or other, right? Anybody can pray for another believer and serve in that mediatorial way. But there is it's easy to kind of say that, well, the priests do that, but then I think, well, pastors kind of do that too, even if it's not like what priests do.
But nobody confesses to you and you pray on their behalf.
Well, certainly not in the way that it's not a sacrament for us.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying. It's
Yeah.
a similar role. I'm not casting aspersions or anything against Catholic priests either. Just pointing out that that's kind of the similar role, or they serve the similar role.
Yeah, that's right. But here is the thing about the Catholic priest. When the priest is ordained, there is something about that ordination. And by the way, this is not true of Protestant pastors, what I'm about to say. When the priest is ordained, they're taking on, that's a sacrament. And so there's another degree of sanctity, of holiness, a little bit, that does kind of set the priest apart in a way that, Protestants just don't think that way. I'm ordained to the office of pastor, but I don't, when I was ordained, I didn't take on any more sanctity or holiness than anybody else can have. Or again, I know, if we had Catholics here who are well versed in Catholic teaching, they could probably correct us in certain ways. And I want to be sensitive to that. But there is, when you ordain somebody and call it a sacrament, there is this idea of taking on some kind of extra sanctity or holiness. Not really, it's because of the function and the office, but it's not really available to the layperson.
Yeah.
Because it's a sacrament and you didn't get that sacrament, right? So I should stop there because I'm obviously not Catholic.
Now we have to do Reformation history.
Right, now we gotta do that, yeah. Okay. All right, so I'm sort of wrapping up here. And what I really am trying to emphasize tonight is the efficacy of what Christ has done. So we're gonna see, we've seen he has this eternal priesthood. It's a better priesthood. He's like us in every way, but without sin. So he's a perfect high priest, but he's also the offering. He's the priest, and he's the offering that the priest makes, right? And his blood purifies the conscience or perfects the conscience. So again, drawing from De Silva, this idea of perfecting. I kind of have to work this over again. And he says, perfecting is the intended action that is accomplished or brought to pass. And the ultimate goal that the writer of the Hebrews has, he wants to get people into God's unshakable kingdom. So we could go back and think about the Sabbath rest, right? That chapter on, there's a Sabbath that remains, a Sabbath rest that remains. So entering into God's presence through Christ, being part of God's unshakable kingdom through Christ, is where we find that rest. And so perfecting the conscience has to do with this kind of eternal redemption. So look at Hebrews chapter 9, verse 12 again, and then we'll go to chapter 12. Nine 12. He enters with his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. Part of the idea of completion is eternity, right? I mean, in heaven, we're not going to have to worry about, well, am I going to keep struggling with these sins I struggle with, right? That's part of the understanding of completion or perfection. Now look at chapter 12, verse 28. We are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Okay. Let me wrap it up here, gathering up some threads. We have the Son's divine nature clearly stated in chapter 1. We have the Son's human nature clearly stated in chapter 2 with references to Psalm 8, right? So you can go back and review, so fully human, fully divine, fully human. And his humanity, all of it, participates in the atoning work that he does. So Christ in his human nature, filled with the Spirit, is faithfully, lovingly obeying his Father, moment by moment, day by day, which is exactly the Christian life. So he's the pioneer, right? He's showing us how this is done, but he's doing more than showing us. He is, through his work, his sacrifice, his priestly activity, his mediatorial activity, he's bringing about the change in us that needs to change so that we can walk this path. So that's the Son's human nature, the eternal plan of God right through the body of the Son. What we're witnessing in the gospel story is the eternal plan. And the writer of Hebrews makes this clear. We've looked at those verses. And then finally, the effect of all of it is really what I've been saying. It's a kind of wholeness, bringing to completion God's eternal kingdom. So he is saying to these people, don't turn away from this, right? Why would you turn away from this? This is God doing everything we need. And we know from experience that this old way didn't work for us. Now that's the controversial part, I know that. But that really is what he's saying. The first covenant did not work for us, and our prophets tell us that, right? They tell us that, and so God has made a new covenant. God in his mercy has made a new covenant, and this time effecting that new covenant through his own Son, in the blood of his own Son. So it's a very kind of, what's the word? It's an absolutely complete giving of God, from God, of God's nature to human nature, so that we can be saved. That's really what the writer is saying here. Okay. Well, we jumped around a lot in those chapters, which means we won't come back next week and just read through chapter 9. And, we're going to kind of work with these themes a little bit, and I'll try to pick up and carry forward with topics as we go. But I think we can sort of work through this book and be finished by May what would that be? The 15th, it would be the 8th, I think. The 15th, it would be our last meeting. Sorry, yeah, 15th. Okay, friends. We'll see you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.